Okay, so let's dive into this really heavy topic, the war in Ukraine.
Yeah.
You guys sent us a lecture by John Mearsheimer.
Yes. And
Prominent.
yeah, he's a political scientist.
Realist.
Yeah. He's known for,
Yeah.
kind of being a little bit controversial.
Yeah, for sure.
But his main takeaway from this lecture is that the U.S. is mainly responsible for the war in Ukraine.
Right.
And I know that might sound...
It's a bold claim.
Yeah, it's a bold claim, and it might sound a little crazy to some people.
For sure.
But before you turn off the episode,
Yeah.
I want to be clear. He doesn't deny that Putin had a big role in this.
Obviously.
But he's offering like a different perspective on why things unfolded the way they did.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting about Mearsheimer's perspective is that it's rooted in like a deep understanding of international relations theory.
Totally.
And it really challenges, I think, the kind of simple narrative that
we often hear in the media.
Right. So the prevailing view is that Putin is just this power-hungry aggressor who wants to, like, rebuild the Soviet Empire.
Wants to, conquer all of Europe.
Exactly. And Mearsheimer's like, hold on a sec, where's the evidence for this?
Right, where's the proof?
Like, he points to Putin's own words.
Yes.
And then this is where I think it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
Putin himself has acknowledged Ukraine's independence.
Yeah, he said that multiple times.
Right. He's even said that he accepts the new geopolitical reality after the Soviet Union collapsed.
Yeah.
Like he doesn't seem to be interested in like...
revanchism?
Yeah, exactly.
Like trying to go back to the old days?
Right. And Mearsheimer takes it a step further.
He does.
He's literally written a book on lying in international politics.
Yes.
So he knows...
He's an expert.
Yeah, he knows.
In deception.
He knows when people are BSing.
Yeah.
And so he uses that expertise to analyze Putin's statements. And he's arguing that, like, these weren't just, like, clever deceptions to, like, lull the West to sleep.
Exactly.
He thinks Putin genuinely saw NATO expansion as the real threat, not conquering Ukraine itself.
So it's not about...
So it's not about land. It's about...
It's not about taking territory.
NATO.
It's about NATO. It's about security.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, and to really understand why NATO expansion was such a threat to Russia, we need to go back in time a little bit and look at how it unfolded.
Yeah.
Especially this pivotal moment in 2008 at the Bucharest summit.
The Bucharest summit, yeah. This is where things really started.
Things start heating up.
Heating up.
Yeah.
Ukraine and Georgia were promised eventual NATO membership.
Right.
I mean, that's not really a subtle move, is it?
Not at all. No, it was a very provocative move.
And what was the reaction in Russia?
Immediate and explosive.
Yeah.
I mean, there are reports that Putin, like, flew into a rage.
Oh, wow.
William Burns, who was the U.S. ambassador to Moscow at the time, he sent a memo back to Washington saying that NATO expansion is an absolute red line for Russia.
Oh, wow.
The brightest red line.
You can't... It's like poking the bear.
Yeah, it's like poking the bear.
Of a stick.
Yeah.
And they didn't stop there, right?
No, they did not.
Like it kept going.
Yeah.
So what happened?
Well, Mearsheimer argues that the 2008 war between Russia and Georgia was an early warning sign, a direct consequence of this NATO expansion policy.
Oh, wow.
And even though the push for Ukraine's membership seemed to cool down a bit after Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, NATO continued to train and arm Ukrainian forces.
So they're turning Ukraine into a
de facto NATO member.
Even without the official membership.
Exactly.
And how did Russia see this?
Well, think about it from their perspective.
Yeah.
Here's this powerful military alliance getting closer and closer to their border.
Right.
Training their neighbor's army. It's like having a rival gang set up shop right next door to you.
Yeah.
And start teaching your kids how to fight.
That's a good analogy.
It's a classic security dilemma.
Yeah.
Each side feels threatened by the other's actions.
Right.
And it leads to this spiral of escalation.
So fast forward to 2021.
Yep.
Things seem to shift gears again.
They do.
Right.
Both Zelensky, Ukraine's president, and Biden in the U.S. renew the push for Ukraine's NATO integration.
Okay.
And we see this play out in high-profile meetings, joint declarations, all reaffirming that NATO goal.
And then Russia starts amassing troops on the border.
Right.
And issues that ultimatum in December 2021.
Yeah.
Demanding written guarantees against further NATO expansion, which they didn't get.
They did not.
And Mearsheimer argues that this was like a last-ditch effort by Russia.
Yeah, a desperate attempt to prevent what they saw as this rapidly approaching existential threat.
Right, and he uses some pretty chilling quotes from Putin himself.
Oh, yeah.
It's like Putin was saying, look, you wouldn't tolerate this.
In your backyard.
In your backyard.
Yeah.
So why are you doing it to us?
Exactly why the hypocrisy.
He even drew parallels to the U.S.'s own Monroe Doctrine.
Yeah, which is really interesting because it shows you how seriously they were taking this.
They felt threatened.
They felt threatened.
Yeah.
The message was clear. Russia felt backed into a corner.
Right.
Their security concerns were ignored.
Like they're being squeezed.
Yeah, and just like the U.S. declared the Western Hemisphere off limits to European powers back in the 19th century, Russia was trying to draw a similar line in their own neighborhood.
Yeah, I could see how
Makes sense.
They would feel that way.
Yeah.
So the stage is set, tensions are high.
Sky high.
What does Mearsheimer say happens next?
Well, he argues that the invasion in February 2022 was a direct response to the West's refusal to budge on the NATO issue.
So they basically just said no.
Yeah, we're not going to negotiate on this.
And Russia's like, well,
this is an existential threat.
We got to do something.
We have to act.
Wow.
And so from his perspective, the U.S. and its allies failed to address Russia's security concerns.
Well, they didn't take it seriously.
And in doing so, they made war.
Almost inevitable.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Wow. That's a bold claim.
Yeah.
But that's his argument.
That's his argument.
Right.
So I know what some people might be thinking, like, is this a blame America narrative?
Right.
Because
a lot of people
pretty
push back hard on this.
Yeah, it's a bold statement, and a lot of people disagree.
A lot of experts say that, you know, he downplays Putin's agency in this whole situation.
It's like they're saying that Putin was going to invade regardless.
Yeah, I mean, they point to his actions in Georgia back in 2008. His rhetoric about Ukraine being historically tied to Russia.
Right.
And, of course, the annexation of Crimea in 2014.
Yeah. Right. So all of that suggests that Putin
had a broader agenda.
Yeah.
Than just responding to NATO.
Right. And what about the argument that NATO's purely defensive?
Right.
That it poses no threat to Russia?
Yeah. Mearsheimer's critics say that that's a flawed argument.
Okay.
They say that NATO expansion isn't inherently provocative.
Okay.
That Russia's security concerns are overblown.
But wouldn't any country feel at least a little uneasy with a powerful military alliance creeping up to their borders?
I think that's a valid point.
Yeah.
And this is where things get complex.
Yeah.
Because there are arguments on both sides. But Mearsheimer's critics would say that, you know, Russia has a history of using the NATO threat as a cover for their own aggressive actions.
So using NATO expansion as a scapegoat?
Potentially, yeah.
To kind of mask their own ambitions?
It's possible. I mean, they believe that Putin's ultimate goal is to restore Russian dominance.
Gotcha.
And NATO is just a convenient obstacle to blame.
So we've got these two very different
lenses.
Yeah.
Perspectives through which to view this conflict.
Right. One emphasizing NATO expansion as like the main provocation.
Right, the main driver.
And then the other pointing to Putin as the
prime mover.
Right. Like he was going to do this no matter what.
Yeah. Essentially.
Wow, it's fascinating how the same set of events can be interpreted.
I know. It's amazing.
So differently.
And it really highlights the importance of examining these issues from multiple perspectives.
Totally. And it's important to note that, like,
Yeah.
it's not black and white, right?
Not at all. There are shades of gray.
Very much shades of gray.
Within these perspectives.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Not everyone who criticizes Mearsheimer completely absolves NATO.
Right.
And not all of his supporters think Putin is entirely blameless.
It's a spectrum.
It's a spectrum, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think the key takeaway here is to really resist those simplistic narratives.
Like good guys versus bad guys. Exactly. Because the truth, as usual, is much more complicated.
Okay, so I think we've laid out, like, both sides of this argument.
We've explored the different interpretations.
Yeah. What are some essential points that you think our listeners should keep in mind?
Okay, so first, there's no doubt that NATO expansion played a significant role in the lead up to the war.
Okay.
Whether it was the primary cause or just a contributing factor, it definitely ratcheted up tensions.
Okay.
And created that security dilemma we talked about earlier.
Okay.
But at the same time, we can't ignore Putin's own agency, his ambitions, and his worldview.
Right.
Those factors were absolutely at play in his decision to invade.
It's like a combination.
Yeah, it's a very complex mix of factors that led to this tragedy.
Okay, so it's not a simple good guys versus bad guys.
No, not
a tangled web.
Yeah, a tangled web of history.
History of geopolitics.
Geopolitics, individual choices. All of these things came together to create this perfect storm.
Right. Does Mearsheimer offer any hope for a peaceful resolution?
He does acknowledge that there were moments, especially in those first few weeks of the war, when a negotiated settlement seemed possible.
But those chances were missed.
It seems so.
And so now we're stuck in this stalemate with no clear path to peace.
It's a tragedy for everyone involved.
Yeah. And I'm curious, what about Ukraine's agency in all this?
Yeah.
Did they have any other options besides aligning with the West?
That's a really interesting question. And one that Mearsheimer doesn't really delve into too deeply.
Okay.
But he implies that Ukraine's own domestic politics and their desire for closer ties with Europe were also factors in the equation.
So it wasn't just the West kind of pushing Ukraine towards NATO.
Right. It seems like Ukraine was also actively seeking that relationship.
Okay, so they had their own reasons.
Yeah, their own motivation.
For wanting to be closer to the West.
Exactly.
So it's not as simple as...
It's never as simple as it seems.
The West is forcing them to.
Right. These are complex sovereign nations.
Right.
With their own interests and goals.
This is a lot to absorb, but I guess that's...
It is.
The nature of complex conflicts.
Yeah. Rarely simple answers.
Right.
Clear-cut villains.
Yeah. The truth is usually somewhere in the middle.
Somewhere in the messy middle.
Right.
Yeah.
What's the takeaway for our listener?
I think the key takeaway is that this conflict is far from over. It's a defining moment in history.
Yeah.
And the consequences are going to continue to shape the world for years to come.
So stay informed.
Stay engaged.
And don't lose sight of the bigger picture.
Exactly. This is a time for critical thinking, thoughtful dialogue, a commitment to building a better future.
Well said. So now that we've talked about the causes of the war, what about the consequences?
Right, because Mearsheimer argues that the consequences of this war reach far beyond Ukraine itself. He's talking about global order, international relations, even the economies of countries far from the conflict zone.
It's pretty daunting.
It is. It's a sobering thought, for sure.
All right, so what about the impact this war is having on the world? I mean, Mearsheimer argues that the consequences go way beyond Ukraine itself.
He does.
He says it's impacting like the global order, international relations,
right? Even
economies of countries far removed from the fighting.
Yeah, I mean, he suggests this war has fundamentally shaken that post-Cold War order.
Okay.
You know, the idea of a world dominated by the U.S.
Yeah.
This unipolar world. It's over.
It's shattered.
It's shattered. And he thinks this is speeding up the shift.
Oh.
Towards a multipolar system.
Okay.
Where power is more distributed.
So it's not just about Ukraine then?
No, it's about a global power shift.
Really?
Yeah, the war has exposed, I think, the limits of U.S. power and emboldened other players like China and Russia to challenge the existing order.
And that's going to lead to a lot of uncertainty, I imagine.
A lot of uncertainty, a lot of instability.
Yeah.
And Mearsheimer warns that this shift in power dynamics could lead to more competition between major powers, miscalculations, and potentially even more conflict.
Wow, so it's like the world's on this geopolitical seesaw.
Yeah, trying to find a new balance.
Yeah.
And in the meantime, we're all feeling the ripple effects.
Yeah, especially in the economy.
Yeah.
Rising energy prices, supply chain disruption.
Exactly. It's hitting everyone's wallets.
Yeah.
That's the reality of globalization. We're all interconnected.
Yeah.
And this war is having a profound economic impact.
Okay.
You know, those sanctions on Russia are a big factor. The war itself is disrupting energy markets and trade.
Right.
Mearsheimer predicts these economic consequences will be long-lasting.
So we're going to be feeling this for a while.
Yeah. I mean, we're already seeing rising inflation.
Right.
Higher costs of living. Slower economic growth.
Yeah, it's a sobering reminder that even if a conflict feels far away, we're all affected in some way.
Yeah, we're all connected.
But is it all doom and gloom? Does Mearheimer see any potential positives coming out of this?
He does suggest that this could be an opportunity for a reset in international relations.
Yeah.
He argues that the war has exposed flaws in the current system and that it could be a catalyst for building a more stable and equitable world order.
So a chance to kind of learn from our mistakes.
Yeah, and create something better.
That sounds like a tall order, though.
It is a tall order, especially in the current climate.
Yeah.
But Mearheimer argues that it's the only path to a more peaceful and secure future.
It's a lot to think about.
A lot to unpack.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
Mearheimer's arguments, the criticisms.
The historical context.
Yeah, the potential consequences. What's the most important takeaway for our listener?
I think the key takeaway is that this conflict is far from over.
Yeah.
It's a defining moment in history, and the consequences will continue to shape the world.
For years to come.
For years to come, yeah.
So stay informed.
Stay engaged.
Don't lose sight of the bigger picture.
Exactly. This is a time for critical thinking.
Yeah.
Thoughtful dialogue. A commitment to building a better future.
Well said. Well, that wraps up our deep dive into the causes and consequences of the Ukraine war.
A complex issue.
Super complex.
With no easy answers.
Yeah. And as always, we encourage you to continue exploring these issues.
Absolutely.
Seeking out diverse perspectives and forming your own conclusions.
Because knowledge is power.
Especially in times like these. And on that note, we'll leave you with this thought. What role can you play in shaping a more peaceful and just world?
That's the question.
Until next time, keep asking questions.
Keep learning.
And keep the conversation going.